Here's the problem that inspired this video. You just flashed your flight controller to Betaflight 4.4, and after flashing it, some parts of Betaflight that used to work under Betaflight 4.3 seem like they've stopped working. For example, you go to the configuration tab and you go down to the GPS settings and you set up your GPS just like you always do, and when you hit save and reboot, it's like nothing ever happened. The option is just disabled. Or maybe you went to the receiver tab and you tried to set the serial receiver protocol to Spectrum SRXL2 because for some reason you still use Spectrum receivers in 2023, and then you hit save and reboot and it seems like it took, but suddenly where did the color bars go? The reason for this is that Betaflight 4.4 has added the ability to leave parts of Betaflight out or add parts of Betaflight that aren't normally included. And if you don't pay attention to these settings when you flash Betaflight, you're going to end up in this situation where something that you expect to work isn't working. Today, I'm going to show you how to work around this. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Here's what Betaflight's firmware flasher tab looks like when we're flashing Betaflight 4.3 or earlier. And basically, all you have to do is select your target that matches your flight controller from this list, or you can just hit auto detect, and most of the time it'll detect whatever's plugged in to the USB port. And then you hit load firmware and you flash. And when you hit flash, what happens is that the configurator goes out to a Betaflight server where the firmware files have been compiled for all of the targets, all of the possible targets in this pull down list. Somewhere out there, there's a file that has been compiled specifically for that target, and it is sort of ready to go. The configurator downloads it, it flashes it, and then your flight controller is ready to go. On the other hand, if I switch to Betaflight 4.4, a new section appears here in the firmware flasher tab, the build configuration section. And this section lets you decide which parts of Betaflight are and are not going to be included. And the first question you might ask is, why wouldn't I just want all of Betaflight? Why are you leaving parts out? And the answer to that is that Betaflight's code has gotten bigger and bigger over the years as new functionality has gotten added, and eventually it gets so big that it doesn't fit into the program memory on the microcontroller that's on your flight controller. Basically, the processor on the flight controller only has so much space. It's like if your hard drive on your laptop got full and you couldn't download that new version of Call of Duty that you wanted to download. It's just not enough space there for it. In the past, what Betaflight has done is drop support for flight controllers that didn't have enough space. So for example, Betaflight 357, I think, was the last version of Betaflight to support F3 processors. Betaflight 4.0 could only run, again, if I'm remembering the delineation point correctly, Betaflight 4.0 could only run on F4 and F7 and bigger processors that have more flash memory space or program memory. But there were other reasons that the F3 was dropped. The F3 also just wasn't fast enough to run the code. With the current generation, the code is getting big enough that it doesn't fit on all of the processors that are used on all of our flight controllers, even the F4s and the F7s, but they are still plenty fast enough to run it. And so instead of dropping support for the F4s and even one F7, the Betaflight developers have just decided to make the code smaller by leaving out the parts that you're not using. Now, the first option that you can select is the radio protocol, and that's going to depend on what receiver you're using and what module you're using. The default is to include Crossfire, Ghost, and S-Bus, which the Betaflight developers know from their... Did you know that your configurator is reporting statistics back to the Betaflight developers? They know what receiver protocol and what motor protocol. They know a whole bunch of stats about how your flight controller is configured. So Crossfire, Ghost, and S-Bus are the most popular control protocols, and they are enabled by default. But you can see here that iBus, if you have FlySky receivers, Spectrum, or SRXL2, some D and some H and X bus. I don't even know what those are. If you were using a receiver that output one of these protocols, then you would need to change this option. In fact, it looks like we even have the option to select just Crossfire if you know that you're only using Crossfire or Express LRS, which also uses Crossfire protocol. You could select that and you could save yourself some of the space that's taken up by Ghost and S-Bus. In fact, that's probably what I would do for most of my builds, although not all. Some of them are using Ghost receivers still. Next, let's look at the other options. And whereas the radio protocol, you can select exactly one of these options, not more than one, With the other options, you can actually enable and disable various of them. So for example, you can see that by default, flash storage is enabled. That's for black box logging if you have a data flash chip on board. GPS is for GPS functionality. LED strip is for programmable LEDs. Standard definition OSD is for analog OSD. High definition OSD is for digital OSD used on like Walksnail, HD0, and DJI. Pin IO is used if you have a built-in function that switches your video transmitter on and off, like some flight controllers do. That would be the Pin IO function. And then VTX is for analog VTXs. That's the video transmitter tab. You can see in this list that there are other functions here that are deselected by default, but if I wanted to enable them, I could. For example, the cam control option, that's for analog camera control. If I click that, it will appear here in the list. And I can disable those options by clicking, for example, if I only have digital video transmitters, so I don't need the VTX function, I could just click that X and get rid of it. I guess I also wouldn't need the standard definition OSD function, sure, and I actually don't need the cam control function either. I'm not going to have a GPS on this quad, fine, get rid of that. Anything in here that I need? Magnetometer, no GPS, so I also don't need a compass. Servos, I'm not using servos on this build. No, I think this is pretty good for me, so I'm going to leave that alone. So we start to see why some of the things that you might want to use would not work in Betaflight 4.4. If they're not enabled by default, then they're just not going to be there. And if you weren't paying attention to the changes in Betaflight 4.4, you might not know why. Part of what makes this confusing is that if I connect to the flight controller, there's no indication here in the configurator that the thing I'm trying to work with has been disabled. If I go to the configuration tab, I can enable the GPS options and they're just sitting there, and yet when I try to actually save them, they'll just reset. Or if we look at the receiver tab, when I try to select the option, it will kind of appear to have worked, but then like things will get weird, like the color bars disappear. Or in some cases, like if I try to choose a motor protocol, like by default only D-Shot is selected, and if I try and choose a motor protocol that wasn't selected, like it'll just seem like it's been set up correctly, and yet it just mysteriously won't work. And there are so many times in FPV that things mysteriously don't work for like just normal effed up reasons, that now we've got this additional one that we have to be aware of. So if you're in that situation, the very first thing you want to do is just double check the options that were flashed to the flight controller. And unfortunately, there isn't an easy way to do that. Basically, you might just want to reflash the flight controller and check the options when you flash it. Save the configuration, flash the flight controller, and then reload the configuration and cross your fingers that whatever wasn't working suddenly starts working again. There are two other menus here that I just want to make sure you're aware of. One is the motor protocol menu. That controls what motor protocols you can select in the motor tab. Almost all modern ESCs are going to be using D-Shot. However, if for some reason you have an older ESC that you're using PWM output, or if for some reason you need brushed or multi-shot or one-shot support, then you would select that. The reason very few people are going to do that, and the ones who are doing it are going to know that they need those options and why. This also might screw you up if you accidentally change it to multi-shot and then D-Shot stops working. So you're probably going to want D-Shot selected there. And then finally, there's the telemetry protocol. And this is the number one way that this is confusing, is that if you are using any modern protocol like Crossfire or Ghost or Express LRS, which uses Crossfire to talk to the receiver, then you don't select any telemetry protocol. With modern protocols like Crossfire and Ghost, telemetry is built in, and there is no separate need to enable a separate telemetry protocol. But with S-Bus receivers, for example, you would need SmartPort telemetry. I'm guessing that FreeSky Hub is the older D8 telemetry, and most of these I think people just aren't going to be using. So if you're using modern protocols, just leave this set at none. And if you're using S-Bus, set it to SmartPort, and then that probably covers most of the use cases. A lot of what we've been talking about has been maybe a little bit annoying, but kind of necessary going forward. But there's one thing in the firmware flasher tab that is just genuinely, yay, it's a really cool thing that they've enabled. And it's the select commit option. Here we're looking at the Betaflight GitHub repo. This is the Betaflight code base. And commits are individual little chunks of code that were submitted by a developer to make a change to the code base. And normally, if you are a developer and you want to try out a feature that is not included in the default Betaflight code base, you have to download all of the code and then add that commit to the code that you're going to compile and then manually compile the code on your desktop. And this is a lot. It's a pain in the ass. Most people aren't going to do it. But the Betaflight developers realize that now all of the compiling is going on in the cloud. They're doing the compiling for you. So they've made it possible for you to choose individual commits and add them to Betaflight just for yourself. For example, here's a person who reached out to me with a bug that they discovered in Betaflight GPS Rescue, where the quadcopter thinks that it has landed when it's really 30 feet in the air, and then it just disarms and crashes. And I reached out to Yvonne about this, and he said, yeah, there's a bug. The devs are aware of it, and they are working on a fix. In fact, right here is the pull request for the code that will fix this bug. And in the past, you would have just had to wait for a new version of Betaflight to come out with the bug fix in it. But you don't have to do that today. If you know the commit number that you want to load, probably because a dev told it to you because you reported a bug, but also you could just be paying attention to the Betaflight GitHub and see a commit that looks interesting to you. If you know that commit number, then you can just go in here and type number and then that number. And then when you flash that version of Betaflight, that commit will be included and you can try out the bug fix. By the way, if you are not seeing the custom defines option at all, like here, where is it? The answer is that you need to go into options and you need to enable expert mode. I just do that all the time anyway. It unlocks some options that might be a little bit less safe for beginners to mess with, but most people are going to end up messing with them anyway, so I just enable it all the time. There's one more gotcha with cloud builds that you need to know about. But before I tell you about it, I want to take a second to remind you that I have a Patreon. Patreon is a website where you can subscribe to me for as little as $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned it. The amount you subscribe at is completely up to you. You can change the amount whenever you like, and you can unsubscribe whenever you like. Patrons get access to my Discord server, which is full of friendly, helpful people who are waiting to talk to you about FPV. There is a buy-sell trade forum. There is a troubleshooting forum. It's just a great all-around resource, and it's only available to people who join my Patreon. But I don't want you to subscribe just to get access to the Discord. I mean, if that's what it takes, then cool, more power to you. There's a link in the video description below. I'd love to have you. I hope you subscribe because, like, one day you look up and you go, God, I've watched so many Bardwell videos. He's helped me with so many problems, and it's finally time that I want to give some. That's how I do it. Like, I'll look up and go, I've listened to 57 episodes of this podcast. I guess these guys have earned my support. And maybe that day is today for you, for me, link down below. If not, that's fine. You know, maybe you're only on episode 52 and, you know, somewhere around 57 or 60, you'll feel like subscribing. If so, it'll be there. If not, I'll keep making the content. Maybe that day will come. The gotcha for Betaflight cloud builds is summed up in this note from the Betaflight developers, which says, if you have something missing from your cloud build that you would normally expect to be present, like a flash chip or barometer, the reason is because the board configuration has not been updated with this information. And what's going on here is that now that Betaflight doesn't include all the hardware drivers and so forth by default, then it's up to manufacturers or the community to tell the Betaflight devs which hardware is on which boards. And in some cases, flight controller targets haven't been updated. So you may flash and you may find that your barometer just doesn't work in Betaflight 4.4 no matter what you do. Or you may find that your data flash chip just doesn't work no matter what you do. The way to work around this is, unfortunately, requires a little bit of manual work. If you end up in this situation, one thing you can do to help other people, not yourself, not today, I'll tell you that solution in a second, but what you can do to help is flash the core only version. That will flash a version of Betaflight to the flight controller that contains all of the hardware drivers that are necessary to support all of the possible hardware that Betaflight might have. After flashing, connect, apply custom defaults. Then go to the CLI tab and click Submit Support Data. After you submit that, you will be given a support data ID. Copy that ID and then go to the Betaflight Discord server. I'll put a link in the video description if you need to join that server. There is a cloud build issues channel, and you can go to that channel and you can just post a message. I am having a problem with missing barometer on my FC. The target is such and such, and here is my troubleshooting identifier. And you can paste that identifier in from the CLI, and the developer who worked on the cloud build is very active here and will take a look at it and see what needs to be done. The other thing you can do to try to get it working right now is this. Don't flash with core only. Again, core only flashes the hardware drivers. It doesn't create a working firmware on the flight controller. It's just for debugging. Instead, you're going to add some custom defines that will add the drivers for the hardware that you might be missing. And the Betaflight developers have some suggestions here. If you're missing a barometer, you can try any or all of these custom defines. In fact, I can just copy all of these, which is all of the barometer hardware that Betaflight might use, and just boop, paste them in there. Sure, why not? And if I was missing a flash chip, I could put these things in. Copy. And let's just go to the end here, put a space, and paste. If I flash this, then these custom defines will add the drivers for the barometer chips, whichever one I have is probably in that list, and it'll get it working. Same with the flash chips. So that's a workaround that's going to work for some people who have missing hardware, but eventually it'll be up to the manufacturers or the community to get those targets updated, and that'll probably work itself out over time. Cloud build functionality is just one of many new things that have changed in Betaflight 4.4. And some of those are cool new features, and some of them are annoying things that are different and will trip you up. If you want to know more about the cool new features of Betaflight 4.4, I'll put a card on screen with my favorite Betaflight 4.4 features. On the other hand, if you're trying to set up Betaflight 4.4 with a digital OSD, it doesn't work the same as it did in 4.3. The instructions and tutorials you're trying to follow don't work anymore, and I've got a video about how to set that up. I'll put a card on screen for that as well. See you there.